11. May 1945. Munich. A 32-year-old clerk named Karl Brenner writes in a school notebook he scavenged from a ruined classroom, "I knew and I did not want to know. That is how the war continues." It is a dangerous sentence. It could not be spoken loudly. It could be quoted against him in a hearing, in an interrogation, in a street argument. It is a private thesis for a public silence. It is a private thesis for a cellier. It is a sentence that will anchor his days for decades, because he will live among people who say they knew nothing, and he will file the papers that help them prove it. He lives in a city of rubble. The law of the street is weight and angle, brick stacks, bent rebar, broken staircases. The measurements come with each step. A wall leans. A stove stands exposed to sky. A headless statue looks over a field of chimneys. Photographs in Bundesarchiv albums show the same angles in Dresden, Cologne, Nuremberg, Hamburg. Everywhere the physics is similar. Movement requires a calculation. Women form chains with buckets and gloved hands. Trauerfrauen. The term moves quickly. It is both praise and necessity. Short, strong. The women stack, carry, sort and smash. They are muscle and metronome. The pace is slow, then steady, then weary, then steady again. Missing people are a category. They are accounted for on boards nailed to wooden posts. They are broadcast on street corners and in the back pages of new printings. Name, regiment, age, last seen. A wife lists a husband and brother. A mother lists 2 sons. A father lists 1 daughter and adds flak helper, last at the Siemens plant. Everyone scans those lists. The arithmetic of loss is numbers in columns and the coldness of ink. The categories are incomplete. The dead, the missing, the buried, the imprisoned, the returned. The last category is the most complex, because a returned brother may not fit back into a room, because a returned father may limp and drink, because a returned son may not speak, or he will speak and cannot stop. American trucks enter from the west. British convoys roll through ruined ports and northern plains. French units take towns along the Rhine and farther south. Soviet divisions hold the east. The maps in Allied intelligence summaries draw the zones with clean lines. The movement on the ground is ragged. Major generals' orders have footnotes. Curfews are posted. Non-fraternization carries the weight of moral pedagogy. Then it is relaxed. Americans smile. Then they don't. What is permitted shifts. The occupation reports available now describe the early weeks as a mixture of relief, hunger, fear, and bargaining. Population docile, one US report says, desperate for food and fuel. Another, from the British in Hamburg, notes a curious blend of denial and shame. The French complain of thefts, of black market spirals along their border. The Soviets note class enemies among the bourgeois and announce land reform in Mecklenburg and Saxony. Munich, 14 May. Karl reads an American notice on a tram shelter with no roof. Curfew at 21,000. Ration cards distributed by neighborhood. Weapons to be surrendered. Nazi insignia to be displayed only for surrender and inventory. He copies the rules. He is the sort of person who copies rules. He survived the last years by staying inside countable lines. He survived Allied bombs by sleeping in a cellar with an index card in his wallet that listed his blood type and the name of his mother. He goes to the ration office. The line is long. Women with babies. Old men with mustaches that seem to belong to the previous century. Boys of 14 with hollow cheeks. The clerk asks for papers. He accepts a stamped card with boxes. The boxes correspond to calories. The mathematics of hunger is a monthly ledger. 1,040 calories per day by official measure in the spring and summer of 1946, sometimes less, often less in Saxony and Thuringia. Reports from the US zone describe workmen fainting at construction sites. People dig in gardens. People strip parks for firewood. Germans go out to farms in the surrounding villages and beg. They learn to barter hard for wheat, potatoes, beets, and eggs. They learn to call cigarettes money. Lucky strikes carry exchange value. Camels carry exchange value. A pack equals a loaf. 5 packs equal boots. 30 packs equal a room for a month, if you can find a room. American soldiers trade, though they are not supposed to trade. German men trade in silence and show their palms. German women laugh and hand over a hidden stick of butter because the arithmetic of a family's survival measures dignity against hunger and uses a different scale every week. Occupation reports note, cigarettes as currency, disruptive but unavoidable. This is the mathematics of necessity. It is not glamour, it is conversion tables. Small folded lists in a coat pocket. 1 American pack equals 1/2 kilo sugar in May. In June, only 1/3. Most people who rebuild streets and sort bricks are women and old men. The Trauerfrauen in Berlin and Dresden feed a myth of gendered heroism that outlasts the rubble. Photographs in Bundesarchiv files of long scarves and bent backs become a shorthand. In the moment, they are just hands and knees and bent shoulders. Someone blows a whistle and they rest. They talk about flour and their children's coughs and the quality of coal. The occupation government needs to know who is who. The ballots of war guilt are asked in the form of a questionnaire. In the US zone, the Fragebogen runs to more than 100 questions. Name, birth, party memberships, stash, positions held. Even donors to winter relief funds are listed. Karl receives his copy in July 1946. He writes no to SA. He writes no to SS. He writes no to the party. He writes mo to the party. City Insurance Office, 1938-44. He writes volunteer in air raid services. He leaves blank the line that asks about writing for party newspapers. He never wrote. He had an appointment to sign his name on forms for pay and pensions and injuries. He signed Heil Hitler for years and then stopped when he was told to stop. He signs now with a plain Brenner. The Spruchkammer hearings begin. They are tribunals made administrative. The words are German, the categories precise. Hauptschuldig, major offenders. Belastet, offenders. Minderbelastet, lesser offenders. Mitläufer, followers. Entlastet, exonerated. The scale is a line from violence to thoughtlessness. The mathematics of guilt requires weights. The papers accumulate. 31 million Germans are in a category to be examined. In the US zone alone, more than 3.5 million cases are opened by mid-1949. The numbers settle. Less than 1% are classed as major offenders. A few percent as offenders. More are classed as lesser offenders. The vast bulk are Mitläufer or Entlastet. The courts impose fines, confiscations, and bans from office. Then they relieve them. The bureaucracy cannot function without bureaucrats. The files carry a slang of absolution. Bundles of affidavits become Perselschein, the soap certificates. You are washed. Your neighbor signs an affidavit. Your former Jewish barber was murdered. Your Protestant pastor signs for you. Your employer signs for you because he wants your skills back at your desk. You get a white card. A Mitläufer. You can stand again behind a counter. The arithmetic is institutional need against moral economy. OMGU's reports from 1947 and 1948 talk with candor about the logic of compromise. Our primary interest is stability, one internal summary reads. The thoroughness of denazification in its original conception is incompatible with the speed of reconstruction. The sentiment is repeated in British and French documents. The Soviets used denazification to remove opponents and to push reforms in land and factories. Then they build a new cadre and call it anti-fascist. In his Spruchkammer hearing, Karl says, "I never joined." He says, "I did not profit." He says, "I was scared." The words are correct. They are also minimal. He does not say, "I stamped the forms because everyone stamped the forms." He does not say, "I knew and I did not want to know." The mathematics of the moment says he should not say this. The person across the table is tired. The stack of files is high. He wants to close a case. Karl is classified as Mitläufer. He pays a fine of 50 marks in old money. Then the currency will change and the fine will be recalculated. He is allowed to go to a desk when there is a desk. German towns in the West do not only contain their own survivors, they absorb a wave. The scale is continental. Between 1944 and 1950, as frontiers are redrawn and governments solidify, between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans are expelled or flee from East Prussia, Silesia, the Sudetenland, Pomerania, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia. Many die along the way. Columns of people with carts are documented by Allied and Red Army cameramen. The language in the Bundesarchiv files is chalk-drawn. Vertriebene, displaced, expellees. The numbers come faster than roofs and stoves. Bavaria takes in Sudeten Germans. Schleswig-Holstein receives families from Pomerania. Hesse takes Silesians. The arithmetic is stark. A city that lost half its housing stock receives tens of thousands of strangers. Karl watches figureless lives poured into the streets. A family of 5 from Königshutte in Upper Silesia takes a corner in his block. A woman from Königsberg claims the right to a bed in a room used by a widow and her son. The city issues a requisition order. Room assignment. It is a paper with a stamp. It is a warrant for resentment. The mathematics of space in the summer of 1946 is square meters divided by bodies. The law writes it in terms of necessity. The intimacy is forced. Families share kitchens with strangers. Children share sheets. Old resentments grow in new rooms. They are rude. They are demanding. They took our dormer. These are the kinds of sentences in oral histories recorded decades later. Germans had fled the East under duress. Germans in the West had survived years of bombing. Everyone is poor. The arithmetic of need does not soften. It hardens. The city of Munich places Karl in a small office on the second floor of a municipal building with one intact staircase. He handles housing allocation cards. The files are a grid of names and dates. He rubs his eyes and squints. He reads, "Apartment on Mullerstrauch, 2 rooms. One family returning from bomb evacuation. Requisitioned 1 room for family of Sudeten origin." He reads, "Attic on Weilerhof. 4 adults, 1 child, stove broken, needs permit for coal. 3 monthly allotments outstanding." Each card is an equation. He solves it. He knows the knack of reading down a column of names and sensing which one will resent his decision the least. He learns to look up to the frame of a shocked window and rest his eyes for a heartbeat and decide. The arithmetic of a city's revival is performed in those beats. It is not a hero story. It is the training of a person who learned to sign forms and keep one eye on the door. The displaced who are not German stay apart and nearby. Displaced persons walk along the same streets but on different schedules. The DP camps are a geography of barbed wire and improvised schools and celebrations and anger. Bergen-Belsen transforms from a camp of death to a camp of life. Fehrenwald, near Wolfratshausen, becomes a Jewish DP town with its own police and newspapers, its own conflicts over Zionism, its own births. Landsberg houses survivors near a town that had housed slave labor for aircraft factories. The Soviet repatriation teams scour German towns for their citizens. Polish, Ukrainian, and Russian forced laborers demand return or state their right not to return. Jewish survivors demand papers to leave Europe entirely. Some of the DPs sell cigarettes on the black market. Some of them laugh in loud voices. Some of them avoid Germans entirely. Some of them watch Germans repair the stones of the houses where they had been forced to sleep on the floor. The contact between Germans and these survivors is both close and cordoned. Allied orders require screenings. Germans in small towns are marched to see the nearby camps and to view newsreel films that are labeled the Nazi concentration camps. The films are severe. The rooms are crowded. The faces in the films are impossible to look at, and impossible not to look at. People cry. Others walk out. Some cover their faces. Some say propaganda. Gus polling in 1946 shows a plurality saying yes, the crimes happened, but also that Nazism was a good idea badly carried out. The numbers shift with time. The mathematics of moral admission is incremental and generational. It is measured in percentages on survey maps. And it is measured in Carl's notebook as a sentence he cannot speak. He writes other lines. The children ask why the house behind us is open to the weather. He writes, I dreamed of the shelter again. He writes in September 1946, they say we will make a new state. The hunger deepens that winter. The hunger winter of 1946 to 47 has become a term in all recollections. It was a spike and a floor. It was the coldest temperatures recorded in years. It was coal stuck in snow on tracks. It was potatoes frozen and inedible. It was coal on American trains that Germans were not allowed to unload, and coal on British trains that arrived 48 hours late, and coal that existed in archives as tonnage and not as warmth. The arithmetic of calories falls below subsistence. In Saxony, it drops below 800 a day for some months. In British zone cities, it is around 1,000. In the American zone, it is measured in a decimal that no one can live on. Under that arithmetic, bodies change. Children's legs thin. Men who worked with iron a few years earlier now work with paper because paper is lighter. Ration cards speak in a language of need. Bread cards, fat cards, meat cards, tobacco cards. There are layers and exceptions. Heavy laborers are entitled to a higher ration. Pregnant women get supplements. Farmers have their own schedules. The cards are also a map of what cannot be delivered. People call them promises, not entitlements. The black market flourishes. A line of smokers stands across from a man leaning on a bicycle. Within months, everyone knows the prices. A kilogram of butter costs $2 to $3 in cigarettes converted. A uniformed man walks by. He looks away. Carl sometimes takes a card from a file and places it in the wrong drawer. He cannot explain it. He will deny doing it. He will say he has to keep the system working. He will not say that the woman in the scarf with the 3 children reminded him of a woman who once brought him soup when he came back coughing and white after a shelter night. He will not say that he remembers how soup smells and how you can smell it, even if there is no soup, and how that smell writes its own mathematics on your hands. May 1947. The bizone is formalized. The American and British zones integrate their economies. The French stay separate. They also integrate later. The Soviets watch. They reorganize. The language of summits and committees and directive numbers that mattered only to a small class of officers becomes the language of everyday life in German cities. There is the Allied Control Council. There is a policy called JCS 1067, which defeated the German economy by design. Later, JCS 1779 modifies rehabilitative policies. At the level of intellectuals, there are debates about guilt and politics. At Carl's level, there are trucks and bread. The Marshall Plan is described in headlines and speeches. It arrives as wheat, powdered milk, machinery, and crates labeled with English words. Care packages arrive in neighborhoods like meals from a wealthy cousin who lives far away and insists on sending condensed soups and chocolate. American generosity, a newspaper writes. American strategy, writes a party paper. Both are true. The arithmetic of aid is geopolitics converted into calories and parts for lathes. In June 1948, the money changes. The Deutsche Mark appears like a curtain rising. The photographs show queues. They show people at windows with their old Reichsmarks like leaves gathered into sacks. They show envelopes with 40 new Deutsche Marks as a welcome money for each person. It is a purge, a reset, and a moral statement. The Reichsmark had inflated into bits of paper. The black market had become logic. Now the black market will threaten to become outdated. Some merchants close their shops in protest. Others open their shutters and fill their shelves. Observers write about how shop windows fill overnight. It is myth. It is also true. Wares that were kept under tables appear on shelves. Prices rise and harden. People with nothing but a ration card have less. People with goods have more. The mathematics of a reset is simple in summary and brutal in detail. You either had goods to sell into the hard currency, or you had labor to sell into a market that had suddenly pitched you into a lower place. Karl counts. He counts his pristine 40 marks, and he counts the new numbers on his desk calendar. He looks at receipts and calculates conversions the way he once calculated the distance between a siren and a bomb. He hears Ludwig Erhard on the radio talking about lifting price controls. He hears the word prosperity used in future tense. It catches on. The word becomes a path, then a destination, then a speech pattern. The Wirtschaftswunder is narrated before it is entirely visible. The factories appear. The plans are drawn. The infrastructure is rebuilt. The American aid helps. So does the habit of work and the skills that were temporarily turned to war. Photographs in annual reports show machines with polished surfaces and men in new work coats. Federal Republic of Germany is not yet the letterhead. That comes in May 1949, when the Basic Law is signed in Bonn. There is a new state in the West and a new state in the East. The people in Munich can feel the borders. They can see them on maps. The Berlin blockade begins in June 1948. The air is filled with aircraft. Children write stories about candy bombers. The narrative is thick, and it does not include the cold coal in Karl's own block. The Cold War enters through commentary, not through a change in how you tear coupons. Then, it enters through job security and through who gets hired for what. Karl is made permanent at the city office in October 1948. He knows why. He is sober. He writes neatly. He does not join parties. When the question of past membership comes back to the fore in a new form, he can reply that he was a Mitläufer and that he paid. When the city needs to fill a division head position, they ask a man who had been excused for a year because of a classification as lesser offender and is now returned under new rules. The 31ers will become a category in the newspaper in 2 years, as the new state passes a law to return old civil servants to their positions. The mathematics of guilt becomes a function of policy. Article 31 covers their cases. They get pensions and steps and respect. The newly formed democracy stabilizes itself with old staff under new rules. Karl watches an older man with a clipped moustache walk down the corridor with a folder under his arm. He hears people say, he is decent, he is competent. He knows the whisper that sits under competent. He writes in his notebook in January 1951, "Our democracy stands on the desks of the same men. Maybe that's why the desks shake." He senses the bargain, and suspects that there are others like him who sense it too. A state that wants to be new and adopts old hands at the levers. A state that seeks legitimacy in law and can only get speed in compromise. Schoolchildren get new books. The pages describe the Weimar Republic neatly. They describe the period of National Socialism in the passive voice. They do not use the word Holocaust. They talk about the war, the bombings, the suffering of refugees. They do not linger on Tauberstrasse 3 in Munich, where, in 1942, 20 Jewish families were taken from a back courtyard and driven to a train. They include a photograph of a bombed church. They do not include a photograph of a ghetto. The memorials get new plaques. The plaques read, "To the victims of war and tyranny." It is a phrase that covers all and hides specifics. It is a formula for grieving that keeps grief safely vague. It is designed to be shared across the street and across political parties. It is a ceremony of silence. It lets neighbors stand together. It lets the speaker move on to the next speech. There are moments that break the general pattern. There are denazification files that bite. There are allied courts that sentence men to prison or death for crimes in camps and on fields. There are interrogations of mayors who sign deportation lists. Here, there are names. Karl hears them in broadcasts from Nuremberg in 1945-46. He hears Hermann Goering's voice, and he hears a judge pronounce. He hears the defendants invent an arithmetic of authority. I received orders. He hears a better arithmetic answer. You had choices. He cannot square these numbers with his own. He sees big names under heavy gavel. He sees big names under heavy gavel. He sees smaller names in his office, and they greet him with polite words. The displaced stay. Some are integrable. They are incorporated as neighbors. A club emerges for people from Silesia and another for those from Königsberg. They hold reunions. They publish newsletters that are half memory and half politics. They carry signs that say, "We will not forget." They publish maps of the Eastern lands. They vote for parties that promise support and recognition. The state gives them subsidies. The arithmetic of guilt and of rights intersects with the arithmetic of demography and of seats in the Bundestag. It creates a pressure system. Out of it comes a federal expellee law in 1953 that codifies their status and grants them rights to parity and integration. In small kitchens, women still argue over a shared stove. Jewish DPs face a different set of decisions. Many leave. Some stay. Fehrenwald empties in 1957. New apartments are built there. The site is renamed. Photographs in local newspapers show smiling couples in new rooms, unaware or unwilling to name the previous names. The camps where survivors built governments for the future become residential neighborhoods for Germans. The mathematics of place is a deep equation. It is not easily solved. It is a subtraction of markers and a multiplication of new lives on old ground. At work, Karl has new forms. There is a new line for party membership, but the party is different. There is a new line for union membership. The unions are both old and new. They talk about co-determination, about Mitbestimmung, about workers on boards. They talk about rights at work and about social partnership. The rhetoric is serious, and sometimes a cover for deals made among men who prefer not to say they once dealt with different kinds of authority. The arithmetic of a workplace is wages divided by hours. It is also the distribution of respect, which is not a number on a payslip. Karl sits under a portrait of the mayor. It is a different mayor from the one whose face was there in 1939. The suit is the same. The tie is darker. The room is brighter. He processes a file for a man named Globke, who is mentioned in the newspaper as a legal expert in Bonn. He reads a note in the newspaper that this man wrote commentaries on laws passed in 1935. He looks at his own file drawer and writes a line in his notebook. Law is a language with long memory. He keeps dates. 23. May 1949, Bonn. The Basic Law is promulgated. 13. August 1961, Berlin. Barbed wire at dawn. 10. September 1952, Luxembourg Agreement for Reparations. Israel receives money to build ships and buy machines and educate children. Ordinary Germans talk about the cost. There is a fight in the Bundestag over words. Karl follows it in the newspaper. He writes, "We pay. It is money. I wonder what we owe in language." The people around him age. Children born in 1947 go to school and pick up new words. They talk about their uncles who came back from Soviet camps in 1955 after a diplomatic visit by the Chancellor. They talk about the late arrival of a silent man. They talk about soldiers still mobilized under a new name, the Bundeswehr. And they talk about how the uniforms are different, but the trams at 17,030 smell the same. They talk about NATO. They talk about the East German slogans heard on radio. They talk about the SED and the GDR. They talk about the SED and the GDR. They talk about a new anti-fascism, official and simplified. A letter arrives at the city office from Berlin asking for data on displaced persons. It asks for numbers. This is a comfort to Karl. He can make numbers. He can put them in tables. He can step away from his notebook sentence and into the arithmetic. He can deliver what the new Germany wants, clarity without confession. He can write 7,440 registered expellees still awaiting housing allocation in District 3 as of 30 June 1955. He can write 294 applications for coal allotments for the elderly in the cold week of February 1956. He can write completed 11 new social housing blocks at Leopoldstrasse, occupancy beginning September 1957. The numbers are accurate. The numbers are decent. He stacks the paper and he drinks his coffee and he goes home. At home, he sits with his wife Hilda, who was a factory assistant, and his son, who reads comic books from the United States and draws helicopters. He listens to his son's questions about the war and hears how the school answered them. He fills in a little. He does not fill in much. He chooses caution. The caution comes in two parts. He worries about the child's nightmares. He worries also about unlocking his own. He has an image of a man in 1943 who cried in a shelter for 20 minutes and then stopped and was never seen again. He does not want to go there. The city opens a new museum. It shows photographs of ruins in the first rooms and a timeline in the next. It quotes the Basic Law in neat fonts. It includes a section on the years 1933 to 1945 that shows red flags and parades. It lists the laws. It lists the camps. It shows a short film of a courtroom where a man in a dark suit listens while a judge speaks words of fire. It includes a wall of names. The names lead to silence. Children walk past. They pause. They move on. The air changes in the early 1960s. Karl feels it the way he feels weather. He cannot name it at first. Then the radio stays on longer in earlier evenings. A trial in Jerusalem is broadcast. Adolf Eichmann sits in a glass booth. He uses the bald arithmetic of orders again and again. He calls himself a functionary. He calls himself a man of transport schedules. Karl is a functionary. Karl knows transport schedules. He sits in an armchair and clenches his fists and says nothing. His son glances at him. His wife knits. She whispers, "We will turn it off if you like." He says, "Leave it." He listens. He writes in his notebook. He used our kind of sentences. He cut men's lives into columns. He used numbers to erase faces. I use numbers to shelter faces. Is it enough? Frankfurt, 1963-1965. The Auschwitz trials. The newspapers do not look away. The narrative changes. There is testimony, again and again, of what was done. There is testimony from Germans who were there. There is testimony from Poles and Jews who survived. The names are not only names in newsreels. They are faces with ties that are too wide and voices that crack. The trials give Germany a mirror that is not the old Allied mirror, not the mirror of foreign judges. It makes the old sentences harder. It makes the phrase, "we knew nothing," sound thinner. People protest. Students take to streets later in the decade, but the conversations begin here. The words at dinner tables change. "Father, where were you?" is asked in sentences with speed. Karl's son asks him in 1966. He answers that he was in a cellar with her mother, which is true. He answers that he filled in a form to make sure that the widow in number 32 had a little more coal in 1947, which is true. He does not say that he once caught himself signing an allocation for a man he did not like in a shaky hand and felt guilty because he could have delayed it. He does not say that in September 1942 he stood near the Isar and listened to a rumor about the East and felt a kind of internal resistance, then felt a pinch of fear and walked away. In the early 1970s, new politicians visit memorials and kneel. Photographs capture this as an icon. It is moral leadership as posture and as confession. It is a moment Karl collects in his mind like other dates. He senses that something is allowed now that had been forbidden by custom. He senses that the language opens a little. He also senses that the old bargains hold. Men still sit at desks who signed on different lines on different letterheads. The files are thicker. The paper is fresher. The years are heavy. All along there are ordinary forms. The city asks for signatures for building permits, for school places, for welfare allotments. Karl thinks of himself as an arm of a new law. He believes in it. He believes in the basic law and in the new elections, and in the way a newspaper can mock a minister without worry. He also carries an internal ledger of small failures. He cannot calculate what he owes. He cannot write it down like a ration card. He cannot place it in a column. He writes, "The mathematics of guilt is not the same as law. In law, you finish a case. In conscience, it does not close." This sentence sits next to the first. It sits like a weight. People around him have their own notebooks. Some of them speak in taverns. Some of them write letters to the editor. Some of them sit on bus seats and think about a table and a room with strangers in 1947. An oral history project interviews them in the late 1970s. The tapes are kept at a university. The voices, decades later, still have an edge when they talk about those people from the East or about our suffering under the bombs. A smaller number of voices are clearer when they talk about the Jews who lived across the street. We didn't do enough. We did nothing. We could not do anything. The mathematics of agency is debated in a two-room apartment in 1978 as if it were a proof that you could sit with to the end. It never yields a clean answer. It never will. From the first months to late decades, outside forces press. The Cold War is a pressure machine. It takes raw material, fear, ideology, money, armies, and produces state positions. In the West, anti-communism is a glue. It binds old sinners and new advocates. It produces a continuity that looks like stability. The mathematics of this is simple at one level. You need people who know the machinery. You cannot build all new machinery in a hurry. You need teachers, lawyers, police, clerks. You hire them. You create legal mechanisms to do so. You call it amnesty. You call it reintegration. In the East, there is an official anti-fascism that uses the language of cleansing to justify a new elite. It also keeps the past at a safe, simple distance by declaring it the story of the other Germany. The camps that were built in the East become testimony that the East now cares. The West takes the other memory, the memory of the Holocaust, as a moral anchor. It takes time for the two to exchange elements. It takes time for the words to catch up with the facts. Karl does not live in the East, but he hears the broadcasts that villains are capitalists and that there are no fascists here. He knows better. He knows there are men in all suits. His work now involves fewer emergency allocations and more plans. He works on a plan to build a new estate on the edge of the city. The plan includes playgrounds. It includes playgrounds. It includes standardized kitchens. It includes orientation to sunlight. He takes pride in it. He knows that a generation ago the same men would have been designing settlement houses along an ideological line. He knows titles change. He believes that this plan will hold. He thinks, the mathematics of this is the mathematics of hours of play in a courtyard that is safe. He is asked occasionally to present a file to a committee. He speaks well. He says, the waiting list is long, but it is moving. He says, the new law will help expellees with interest-free loans. He says, the integration is far along. He does not mention the man who appeared in his office in 1954 and shouted, "You took our land, you owe us a garden." He does not remember, until later, the face of that man looking like his own father. There is a wedding in the family. There is a death. These are the personal arcs that overlay the civic. They set the tempo of memory. In 1972, Karl's mother dies. She dies quietly. He opens her drawer and finds a small envelope of letters. One is from his brother Hans, written in 1941 from the front. "We see no men," it says in a half-finished sentence. Then the next line reads, "It is cold." The letter ends. Hans never returned. He fell near Smolensk. Karl knows this. He holds the letter. He looks at the date. He thinks about how the day was in Munich in 1941. Sunny, windy, cool. He writes in his notebook, "My brother's letter was half a confession and half a family note. The math of brothers is different. It has no court." In the year 1979, a teacher from the local high school writes to the city office, asking for permission to bring students to see how the housing allocation worked right after the war. The teacher wants to show the complexities of everyday life. Karl agrees. He pulls old forms from a cabinet. He shows the students cards with names and weights. He points to the colors used to indicate the severity of need. He says, "This is how we did it." A boy asks, "Could you decide to favor someone?" Karl says, "There were rules." The boy asks, "But could you?" Karl says, "Yes." The boy pushes, "Did you?" The room holds quiet. Karl looks at the forms. He says, "Sometimes." The teacher nods. The students write notes. They file out. The boy will grow up and tell his children that in 1979 a man told him the truth in a city office, and that he has never forgotten that tone. Karl retires in 1980. He receives a framed certificate and a pen. His colleagues clap. The city council sends a letter. They all stand for a photograph. It will go in a newsletter that he will not keep. He walks home with Hilda and stops for a coffee in a clean cafe built where a bomb fell in 1944. He looks at the polished glass. He looks at the tables. He cannot sit at a table in such a place without one small part of his mind calculating distance to shelter. It is automatic. It is an old arithmetic that does not leave. He no longer flinches at sirens. He has new nerves. But there is a remainder in him that will not zero. He begins to read more. He picks up new histories. He reads memoirs. He reads an Allied interrogation of a mayor who said, "I fought to help the Jews." He reads a survivor's testimony about a winter march. He reads My Opposition by a man named Klemperer, who wrote down the words while the time was happening. He reads newspaper reports about new trials of old men in the 1980s. He reads a study of opinion surveys from O.M. Gus and realizes how often people in 1946 said sentences that he heard at the time and did not answer. He reads and sometimes puts the books down and stares at the white of his wall. Carl has friends who tell him to stop. They have strategies that worked in the 50s. The strategy of duty. The strategy of work. The strategy of forgetting. They say, why go back there? He hears their sentences as the sentences of a different arithmetic. A debt you do not recognize. A problem you solve by naming it solved. He hears his first sentence in his head, the one from May 1945, and knows he is still living under it. He goes to the cemetery. The stones are neat. The grass is neat. There is a section with a memorial for victims of war and tyranny, and another for the dead of the East. He stands by both and feels the pull of two narratives. He knows both hold truth and both can hide other truths. He watches a woman with a child walk by. She is teaching the child to read the dates on the stones. She skips the years 1939 to 1945. She points to a neat 1963 and says, "That's your grandfather." She whispers something about the war and he cannot hear it. When he is 75, he opens his old notebook. The first line is still there. "I knew, and I did not want to know. That is how the war continues." He writes under it a date and a place, 11 May 1945, Munich. He writes a second line. "I spent 35 years in a small office measuring out rooms and coal and forms." He writes a third. "I kept to rules and I converted feelings to numbers because that is what was needed for life to go on." He writes, "It worked and it failed." He writes, "It saved some people 1 week of cold and 1 week of hunger. It did not change my first sentence." He returns to the city office once to collect an old folder and to leave a note for the younger clerks telling them how the files are organized. He writes an instruction on a piece of brown paper. The allocation cards in drawer C are arranged by street, not by name. He thinks of what lies under that sentence: years of lives, years of problems moved from pile to pile. He thinks of his own life as a kind of allocation. He wonders if he could have lived differently. He cannot solve the arithmetic of that question. It is not a number, it is a choir. He walks through a revised city. The rubble is gone. The rubble is in pictures. The rubble is in children's books about history. The rubble is in speeches. It is not underfoot. He knows where it lies now. He knows, too, that the war ended on a particular day in 1945 and continues in particulars, small and large, in 1950, in 1960, in 1960, in 1980, in 1990. It is a line that moves inside the mind and across paper. It is a front that cuts through files and through a child's question and through the moral geometry of a rumor. He makes a list. He writes rubble. He writes Trümmerfrauen. He writes hunger. He writes questionnaires. He writes Spruchkammer. He writes Mitläufer. He writes Mitläufer. He writes Persulschein. He writes Expelles. He writes DP camps. He writes OM Gus. He writes Adenauer. He writes balls. While for he writes O-parcels. He writes Erhard. He writes Erhard. He writes basic law. He writes 31ers. He writes schoolbooks. He writes schoolbooks. He writes schoolbooks. He writes memorial. He writes Eichmann. He moves them around. He tries to calculate a picture. It is never complete. He knows this is not failure. He knows this is the condition. He closes the notebook. He keeps it in a drawer with old receipts and a stack of ration cards he saved as a living piece of math. A file in the Bundesarchiv shows an occupation report from 1946. It reads, The average German citizen wants to eat, wants work, wants safety. He is not inclined to consider political or moral questions at length at this time. It is a cold sentence. It is true and not complete. It hides all the lives in one line. It hides the mathematics of compromise, which made a state that eventually taught its children the facts it hid from itself at first. When Karl turns 80, he makes a note on a small card. It is not a ration card. It is a memory card. It says, "I was a junior in one bureaucratic machine and a mid-level in another. I made small, humane choices inside a system that made many inhumane choices easier. That is the arithmetic." He places the card next to the notebook. In 1995, a memorial is unveiled in his city that names the deportation location and dates. It is not the vague war and tyranny. It is specific. It lists the street and the day. It lists the trains. It is a conversion of a ledger that existed in an office in 1942 into stone. It is the mathematics of record turned into a form of mourning. Karl stands in front of it and removes his hat. He reads all the words 3 times. People pause and then go. He stands longer. Now, in his final years, the city asks him for an interview for an oral history. He hesitates. He consents. He sits in a chair and tells a young historian about forms and stamps and the smell of coal. He says, "We had curfews." He says, "We had cigarettes." He says, "We had a drawer where someone stronger than me could put a card and the person would get a room." He says, "I did not ask the right questions and I did not find the words." The historian nods. She asks him for his birth date. He tells her. She asks him for his spouse's name. He tells her. She asks him for his earliest recollection after the bombs stopped. He says, "The sky was the ceiling." The arithmetic of a city in post-war Germany is now taught in numbers and anecdotes. His story is one among many. It is both typical and not. It is a story of one man who kept to rules and found the rules were made by people who had made other rules before. It is a story of a man who learned to keep quiet and then learned to speak and found it was always late. It is a story that does not absolve and does not condemn. It weighs. On a late October morning, Karl sits at his table and writes his last note. The sun strikes a cup. The sound of a tram rises. He writes, "The front line for me after 1945 was a stack of papers that told me where to place a bed and a stove. It was a ledger of names. It was my memory. All my life I tried to balance the columns. The math does not close. It adds to itself and asks you to look." He closes the book. He places it next to a ration card. He smooths the paper. He looks out the window where he once calculated the angle to the shelter and sees only blue. The date at the top of that first page does not change. 11. May 1945. The line below it does not change. "I knew and I did not want to know." That is how the war continues. He knows that it is still true. And he knows that for him, and for those like him, after the guns fell silent, the front did not lie across a field of fire, but ran through an office, through a drawer, through his hand as it hovered over a form, and through the memory that held him to account.